Hey Gulf Country fans! This video is all about refurbishing the main fuel pump. If you happen to catch my fuel tank video, then you saw me work on the pre-pump, highlighted here in yellow. The pre-pump sends fuel over the blue fuel line to the main fuel pump, which is mounted to the car's underbelly. Here's that blue fuel line in real life, running from the fuel tank to the main fuel pump. There are 4 M8 nuts that fasten the fuel pump bracket to the car's body. I pre-soaked these nuts with Marvel Mystery Oil, then carefully backed them off with my impact wrench. All of them came off without any trouble. Next, there are 4 metal retaining clips or speed nuts that require a little convincing to let go because they partially grip the threads of the 4 mounting studs. This is one of those speed nuts. I'll replace all 4 of them. After unhooking the wire harness, I disconnected all 4 sending hoses. Here's a closer look at the fuel pump assembly. I started disassembling the unit by removing the 4 metal spacer bushings from the bracket mounts. Then I slid off the 4 rubber vibration dampers. I removed the fuel filter next. There are 4 rubber mounts attaching the bracket to the plastic fuel pump case. There's a metal stud bonded to either end of the solid rubber mount. I had some difficulty removing the rusty nuts from these studs. My first attempt to remove one of these mounts broke off a small piece of the plastic case. If you watch closely, you can see a bit of black plastic land on the workbench. I moved on to the second mount, but only succeeded in breaking the rusted stud. After breaking all 4 mounts in one form or another, the fuel pump case was no longer connected to the bracket. There were still parts of 3 of the rubber mounts attached to the bracket that I needed to remove. Through trial and error, I figured out that I could just grip the metal base of the stud with a 17mm wrench while turning the 10mm nut with a socket. The last rubber mount I removed was the only one to come off intact. I ran the rusty bracket over my wire wheel to remove as much loose rust as possible before taking it to the blast cabinet. After a thorough de-rusting, it was time for 2 coats of self-etching primer. I prefer to flip the part between coats so that I can make sure to spray it from all possible angles. I finished the bracket with 2 coats of gloss black Rust-Oleum. The electric fuel pump motor was attached to the plastic case with 3 screws. The heads on these screws didn't have any recognizable slots in them, so I couldn't remove them normally. I decided to drill out the screw heads. I used progressively larger drill bits to remove more and more of each screw's head. It took a long time. In retrospect, I should have just cut a slot in each screw with my Dremel tool so that I could back them out with a regular screwdriver. I edited out the drilling of 2 of the 3 screws in order to shorten this video segment. Turns out I had to resort to the Dremel tool anyway. I used it to cut off the remnants of the drilled out screw heads. With the screw heads gone, I was able to slide out the electric motor. I carefully removed the strainer, and then the O-ring, before giving the motor a proper cleaning. This motor should be tested before reassembling everything. I cut up a clean jug and filled it part way with fresh gasoline. Then I submerged the electric pump motor and wired it up for testing. It's time to remove those 3 screws that I decapitated earlier. I used my vacuum pump to test the one-way check valve on the fuel outlet that feeds the engine. That's good. There's a valve. I first tried installing the pump motor, O-ring, and strainer together in the same way they came out of the case. But the O-ring wouldn't cooperate, so I tried installing them separately. This worked. I bought 3 new screws to replace the ones that I drilled out. The O-ring was still putting up a fight, so I had to carefully tighten the screws a little at a time. This process of gradually and evenly tightening the screws ensured that the O-ring would seat correctly. I started to reattach the bracket to the fuel pump case using new hardware. But the holes in the plastic case had grown in size over the years thanks to deterioration. The replacement washers that I bought were not much larger than these holes, so they slipped through when tightened. Oh, washer's too small. Washer's too small. After removing the washers, I replaced them with some stainless steel fender washers that I had lying around. These worked a lot better. Next, I installed the 4 mounts that attach the bracket to the car body. The rubber vibration dampers go on the bracket first. The metal spacer bushings can then be inserted into the rubber dampers. Finally, the speed clips can be slid over the dampers and onto the metal spacers. The slotted side of the speed nut faces up towards the car. I bought a new fuel filter to replace the old one and made sure that the part numbers matched. Here I'm checking which way the fuel filter goes on by pulling up reference videos that I shot before taking everything apart. This old hose connected the fuel pump outlet to the fuel filter inlet. I replaced it with a new piece of fuel hose. This unit is ready to go back on the car. Before reinstalling the fuel pump assembly, I used my tap and die set to chase the threads on the 4 mounting studs. Off camera, I also chased the threads on the 4 matching nuts. I bought a new fuel line clip to replace one that I had broken during teardown. One of the hoses and the wire harness need to be fed between the bracket and the case before the fuel pump assembly can be mounted on the car. I used a deep well socket and the handle of a dead blow hammer to gently seat the speed clips snugly against the car. Then I added the 4 M8 mounting nuts to secure the speed clips. Time to reconnect all the hoses. This green fuel line is the main output to the engine. The blue fuel line is the main input from the gas tank. This big output port sends excess fuel back to the gas tank. It's different from the other ports in that its 11mm diameter is larger than the 8mm tube that it feeds into. The factory hose is therefore tapered down from an 11mm inside diameter at one end to an 8mm at the other end. I had to snip off part of the skinny end of the factory tapered hose because of its corroded crimp fitting, so it's now too short to bridge the gap. I bought an 8mm to 8mm hose barb fitting so that I could extend the factory hose with a bit of new 8mm fuel hose. This hose wouldn't slip on, so I lubricated it with a drop of soapy water. I didn't like having those 4 worm drive hose clamps on that short piece of hose, so I swapped the 2 middle ones with the spring clamps that I installed earlier on the hose between the fuel pump motor and the fuel filter. I think it looks a lot better this way. Thanks for watching. My next video will highlight the restoration of the heat shields.